Well, hello and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is BRN AM for Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020. And here are our top stories. The Department of Justice may block Visa's acquisition of Plaid, and the Ant Group is set up to be the biggest IPO of all time. Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is Daniel Klein. He's lead advisor and executive producer for 7 Investing. Dan, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Good morning, Jeff. Always happy to talk about and more.
Well, and very funny, Dan. Great to have you as always. Love your expertise, especially around technology. So this is a really interesting story. It was recently announced that Visa was going to acquire Plaid, and Plaid is really the backbone for a lot of different financial apps. All sounds nice and dandy and really kosher. And now the Department of Justice and other bodies within the federal government are taking a look at whether or not this violates any trust. What's your take on this story?
So I'm skeptical of the need for this. I'm glad they're taking a look, but I don't think with technology there's a major barrier to entry. And I understand this is a massive product and a huge financial backbone, but what stops Amazon or Square or whoever else or American Express from going in and creating something that thing? If there really is a monopoly, I feel like there are enough players who could say, hey, I don't want to work with that. I'm always a fan of the DOJ saying, hey, if you want to make this deal, you still have to sell to these competitors at a fair price. Here's how we're going to determine that. There are ways to do that. There are levers to do that. With big technology, I'm skeptical of the government's ability to regulate.
Well, I certainly agree with you. I think the federal government, the legislators have shown themselves to be a little behind where technology is. And look, when you're competing against other global interests, you want to make sure that you have the latest technology. So certainly you don't want to let regulatory and legislative get in the way. But clearly there's a need for regulation in general when things become, we saw this in the 90s. I don't know if you remember the Microsoft when they were shipping their browser and excluding other browsers. And then the earliest that I can remember is the Bells. Remember when they broke up the Bells, which was the telephone company at the time? They broke them up because of a monopoly. Dan, what is, this is really important infrastructure in building financial apps. I mean, this is something that is really needed by the market.
So Jeff, in my opinion, it's become a little tricky to know what a monopoly is. Like if one company buys all the pizza places in a 30-mile radius of your house, that's a monopoly. They have a monopoly on pizza. But maybe you can just go for Chinese. But if one company buys all the restaurants, that's different. And I think with technology, the question is with what Plaid does, are there other ways to do it? Are there legitimate other options, or are there solutions that can be built? I think about a recent merger, the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint, that basically they had to claw their way to approval because the government hung up on the idea that we'd be going from 4 phone companies to 3. And what they should have been focusing on is we'd be going from 2 giant phone companies, AT&T and Verizon, to 3 giant, equally competitive phone companies. And it made a lot of sense to do that, to not have a limping, weakened Sprint and T-Mobile having to grow slowly and organically. Instead, we now have a 3-tiered monster battling for us. And I'm sorry, when 3 people are fighting against each other, that's not a monopoly. I would argue that 2 isn't a monopoly, because the word monopoly has the word mono in it, which means 1. If I'm wearing glasses, that's not a monocle. So I think sometimes the DOJ gets hung up on the politics, on the optics of things, and I think with tech, maybe they just don't have the wherewithal. I don't hear Square or any of their competitors, screaming that this is a monopoly and Visa shouldn't be allowed to buy it.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And people aren't, if you go back to the Microsoft example that I was mentioning earlier, there was a lot of people. You think about the browsers, the Mosaics of the world, the Netscapes. Those are names that probably some of our viewers haven't recalled in a long period of time. But they were really being shut out of this operating system that was available in some 85%, 75% of all the platforms, of all the new computers out there. So there was some clear concern. I think you're right. If you're not getting an argument out of the Squares, et cetera, then maybe you have to, if they're not concerned, why should you be? Especially if these people are in the competitive market developing products and services and you're just a regulatory entity that is regulating it. But Dan, what does this mean for the broader marketplace? We often talk about tech, we talk about streaming, we talk about OTT, we talk about all these other things. What does all this mean for the broader tech world?
So we're struggling with how to regulate tech. We've talked about the Apple Store, which is a closed loop. You really can't install something on your iPhone without going through the Apple Store unless you, quote, break your phone.
Yeah,
Yeah,
jailbreak it.
which violates all your warranties. So that's not a great idea for most people. But Apple is saying, well, anyone who meets our standards can get in the Apple Store. And that's a real gray area of like, is Apple keeping, hardcore pornography out of the Apple Store a violation of your rights? Like, I don't know the answer to that. And whereas with Android, there are ways, it's not super easy. There are ways to install things in your phone that don't go through the Google Play Store. So it's all really tricky. And I've talked about this before. I want to see the industry regulate itself. I'd like there to be standards and rules that Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, whoever sit down and agree upon and hold themselves to, that then become de facto law. I've talked about OSHA before, but when there's an OSHA standard, it's not law, but it is de facto law, meaning if you've made your product to meet the industry agreed upon standard, you probably don't have any liability if it doesn't perform correctly. And I think the tech industry would be better off doing that than the US government.
Dan, you talked last week about some of the key tech trends that were here to stay post-pandemic, and one of them, contactless payments, mobile payments. We have people of all age ranges doing this. This seems like a nice fit with Visa, a big bank credit card provider. Many of us have Visa cards. Seems like a nice fit to get us to that next level, which is we're all going contactless. We're going to be carrying very little cash, whether we are a millennial, a Gen Z, a Generation X like you and I, or Boomer generation.
Jeff, I just got back from a casino, so I'm carrying a very lot of cash. But that being said, normally I do not carry much cash. But I would point out that contactless payment is hit or miss. Apple has generally done it well. You go to Whole Foods, you can use your Apple Pay. It's not difficult. Even with the mask on, you can put your passcode in. We've talked about the vending machine in my building where you have to like bend down and do facial recognition, and it's really tricky to get everything done in time. We've talked about Panera Bread, which in theory takes multiple methods of contactless payment, but it doesn't work half the time. So yeah, I think Visa and Plaid could advance this, and it's something that needs to be advanced. It needs to be seamless. It needs to be as easy as it is to pay at Whole Foods any place. And there also needs to be protections that you don't accidentally pay. Jeff, you don't want to walk by a gas station and all of a sudden you've paid. That's
for everyone else's gas.
Yeah, and I'm teasing a little bit, but like there are some problems. I've seen my payment screen come up and I'm like, what am I paying for here?
Yeah, well, look, I think that this is going to delay but not end the acquisition by Visa or the merger by Visa. And there's clearly discussions that need to be had. There's obviously concern, but they'll have to work through it. Dan, I want to go to a quick commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about Ant. And no, I'm not talking about the Pink Panther, dead ant, dead ant. No, I'm talking about what is arguably the biggest IPO ever. You're going to want to stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
Hi folks, Joe Namath here, and if you're on Medicare, this is important. You're now entitled to eliminate copays and get dental care, dentures, eyeglasses, prescription coverage, in-home aids, unlimited transportation, and home-delivered meals, all at no additional cost. Plus, your zip code may have coverage with the Give Back benefit that adds money back to your Social Security check every month. Look, with the uncertainty of the virus and vaccines, you need to get everything you're entitled to. Here's the bottom line. Call to get significant benefits at no additional cost and see if your zip code has coverage with the Give Back benefit. Millions of people have trusted the Medicare Coverage Helpline. You can too. Call now. It's free.
Call 1-800-924-3920. That's 1-800-924-3920.
Welcome back. We're talking to Dan Klein of 7 Investing. Dan, thanks for staying with us this morning.
Thanks for keeping me.
Well, Dan, I had a horrible joke, and this was a joke when we were kids, the dead ant joke with the Pink Panther. What happens when the Pink Panther steps on the ant, dead ant, dead ant. But I want to give you an opportunity to come up with a better joke, but I want to really get in deep here on this ant IPO. What's it going to mean for not only Chinese and foreign investors, but also here in the U.S.? So go ahead with your joke first, and then we can get into this.
Jeff, I was going to do 20 minutes on late 2000s comedian Ant, which is a very obscure name, or maybe talk about my favorite Avenger, Ant-Man. But no, the Ant Group IPO is going to be massive, and I'm guessing this is a company very few Americans have heard of.
I think you're right, Dan. I don't think, maybe if you read the financial press, maybe you've heard of it because it's so big. But in general, I don't think people even understand what ant is. What is ant other than an insect?
So this is a very different type of IPO. So this is led by Jack Ma, who created Alibaba. And their core product is Alipay, which is basically a cross between your Square, your Venmo, all your different payment options. And it's primarily in China, though there is some use of it here in the US to generally send money to China, but it's primarily in China. And it's revolutionized banking in a country that had a lot of unbanked people. So it's a rare IPO that they are profitable, they are already massive, they are the big player in their market, and they're aligned with Alibaba, the major retail player in the space. So this isn't, I normally say I don't touch IPOs. In this case, I probably won't touch it simply because it's going to go insane on the first day. It's also trading in China and Shanghai, in Hong Kong and Shanghai, which is not easy for every US person to trade on. So some brokers like Fidelity, you can buy shares directly. But when it comes to buying this, you want to look at what price it comes out at and how crazy it goes on day one. It might have doubled before you even have a hint at getting shares. So it's one where if I could buy in at the strike price or close to it, I'd actually probably buy some. In this case, I'll probably sit back. And normally with an IPO, I tell people wait 2 or 3 quarters, but we've had a lot of financial transparency here and we trust and understand management.
Dan, what does this mean for other contactless payment organizations? We talked about Plaid and Visa in the first segment, but what about Amazon? We have talked on the program about Amazon Pay and this trend of a cashless society. If this IPO goes as it is expected, and all signs say it will, but we have to see how it all goes. And this is primarily within China, which has over 1 billion people. What does this mean for the prospects of an Amazon or an Apple within the confines of China and those customers?
So in general, to operate in China, you're working with Chinese partners. That's largely not been true for Starbucks, which has its own mobile pay ecosystem that it uses. But Amazon operating in China, and I don't know if they operate there at all or to what extent they do, would likely work with an ant group and have some payment contracted out. Generally, China, to give you the blessing to operate there, wants you to partner with locals. That said, with Alibaba in their market, they're not looking for Amazon. They're not opening the doors for Netflix. So China is a very selective market when it comes to which U.S. companies. Like, for example, they'll let a certain amount of American movies in, but they're very, very careful with it. They're very controlling on it. So I don't see China as like an open market for a lot of American companies, because China's going to, like, will they do business with Tesla? Absolutely. They're not necessarily going to do business with a lot of the companies you just listed there.
And Dan, what about the reverse? What about them coming to the U.S. Under the current climate, but also trying to displace the Amazon, displace the Apples, displace the Visas? How does that work? And also not just the U.S. What about abroad in India, where we've talked about the unbanked?
Yeah, it's Southeast Asia that's more likely for expansion. So, they'll come up against Sea Limited and some other companies that are in that space. And it is a really competitive market. Their U.S. exposure is largely going to be, people with family in China that are using these products to move money around. It's not very likely that you're going to go to like your local Publix or Piggly Wiggly or Stop and Shop or whatever it is and use, Alipay to pay. That doesn't seem very likely. So I do think this is a company that has made a conscious choice to not trade on U.S. markets. They're trying really hard to just not get involved in this whole current U.S. regulatory market. But this isn't Luckin Coffee. This isn't a startup where you're not quite sure of the numbers. This is Jack Ma, who's one of the most credible people in, the entire financial world. So if you do have access to shares, I would consider buying them. This is a company that's set up to be a winner in a market that controls competition.
And Dan, from a decentralized finance point of view, so let's kind of play this out down the road. Do these companies, like an Ant, like an Amazon, eventually require you to buy? Like, do we get to a place where they require you to use their payment methodology rather than use your Visa, MasterCard, Discover, or Venmo, or PayPal? I mean, do we get to a place? Is that where this is all headed? We often talk about DeFi in terms of crypto, but what about here?
I actually think and this is just a guess, this is not my space, but from the retail point of view, which is my space, I think we're moving more to a world where just everything is accepted and intertwined. I mean, if you're using Venmo, it's tied to your credit cards, your bank account. I think a lot of these payment methods, like my Starbucks mobile order and pay, is tied to auto refill from my bank account. So, I think a lot of this is going to be integrated where you may not even be sure what's happening behind the scenes. I don't think we're going to move to like an Amazon closed payment world where like Amazon only takes Amazon and you can't use PayPal on Amazon. I think you're going to move to more of a world where you have a lot of choice. And sometimes that choice is less visible than others, where it's a lot of places you check out and the option is there to put in a credit card, or there's a PayPal option, or there's a Shopify Pay option. That might be there a little more seamlessly in the future, where you set your preferences in your phone or in your browser. So I actually think we're moving to a world with more choices, not less.
Well, Dan, it's going to be interesting to see. Thank you again for coming on the program, and thank you for your perspective. I look forward to having you back on the show very soon.
Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN AM. Hey, have a topic of interest or someone you think we should talk to? Drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the news in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, check out today's edition of our newsletter, The Morning Pulse. So until tomorrow, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Are you being audited and do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Is the IRS threatening to take more of your money? Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. The IRS can freeze your assets and seize your bank accounts, but you can stop these IRS actions. The Tax Doctor will work with you using our years of experience to represent your case to help you get the best resolution under the IRS guidelines. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. We've handled thousands of cases, so we know what we're doing. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a tax doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Call 800-224-6439.